With blasting sirens screaming outside, the billionaire resort CEO held up my payroll request in front of every contractor and said, "Sign by noon, or let your daughter watch your crew lose everything." The contract cut my pay and made my small company liable for cracked homes, ruined wells, and explosives I didn't control. At 11:58, I left her pen on the table, pulled the red county access permit off her gate, and walked back to my pickup. At 12:06, her replacement crew started one excavator, and the county shut down her entire $480 million mountain resort, because the only legal road in still had my name on it. The first blast siren started at 8:17 that morning, thin and mean, through the unfinished glass walls of Hart Summit's arrival pavilion. Snow had crusted along the plywood seams, and every subcontractor on that mountain was packed around a folding table, pretending they were there for a normal coordination meeting. Vanessa Hart stood at the head of it in a black coat, clean enough to make the rest of us look like we had crawled out of the road cut. She laid a revised contract across my rolled plans with 2 fingers. "We need alignment today," she said. Alignment meant a 24% reduction in my remaining price. Payment stretched another 60 days, and a new indemnity clause making Cole Civil responsible for damage from blasting done by a subcontractor I did not hire, supervise, or control. I read the clause twice while the siren faded outside. Below that ridge were ranch houses, private wells, cattle crossings, and a school bus turnaround I had personally marked on the safety plan. My crew had already reported vibrations stronger than the certified blast limits allowed. I pushed the papers back and said, "I'm not putting my name under another company's explosives." Calvin Rusk smiled like I had walked into a room built for exactly that sentence. He told everyone my company had requested accelerated payment 2 weeks earlier to make payroll. A few men looked down at their boots. Vanessa looked straight at me. "Then you understand better than anyone why this is not the day to become difficult." Through the glass behind her, I could see Sophie sitting in my pickup with her hood pulled up, school canceled because of snow, watching grown men who had worked beside me for years pretend not to notice her father being cornered. Vanessa set her pen on top of my plans and gave me until noon. If I did not sign, Hart would terminate my company and bring in a national contractor already waiting in Denver. By 11:55, the pavilion had gone quiet in that special way. A room gets quiet when people want to witness a man fold without admitting they came to watch. Vanessa returned and said, "Accept the terms or leave the site, Mr. Cole." I closed my folder at 11:58, placed her pen beside the unsigned agreement, walked to the gate board, and removed the red county permit placard issued to Cole Civil. "Then I'm leaving," I said. At 12:06, Hart's replacement contractor climbed into an excavator. Before the bucket touched dirt, Rachel Kim stepped through the gate and ordered the machine shut down. The permit did not follow Vanessa's money. Once Cole Civil was no longer responsible contractor, the only legal heavy equipment access to Hart Summit was suspended. Vanessa stared at Rachel like the county engineer had just confused a paperclip for a bridge girder. "Transfer it," she told Calvin, already reaching for her phone. Rachel stayed calm. Cole Civil, she explained, had certified the haul road, Snowmelt Creek crossing, temporary retaining walls, erosion controls, and emergency traffic plan attached to that red placard. A replacement company could not inherit my responsibility because Hart had found one with bigger trucks. They had to inspect it all and recertify it before the county could issue new access authority. Under normal weather, Rachel said, that review could take 3 to 5 weeks. Hart Summit had 18 days before the financing agreement started bleeding delay penalties. Vanessa turned on me in front of both crews. "You're taking the permit hostage." I kept my hands in my coat pockets because they wanted to shake. "I didn't cancel anything," I said. "You ordered the legal permit holder off your site. She told me to remain permit holder on paper while the Denver contractor did the work. That was the kind of offer desperate men were supposed to call practical. I told her no. I would not be legally responsible for decisions I no longer controlled. Halt sent my 19 employees home before lunch cooled in their trucks. A few would not look at me. One asked whether Pride was paying wages now, because the replacement outfit had been ready to keep them working if I had signed. Marisol Vega found me near the fuel tanks and said Halt was freezing disputed invoices until access resumed. Her concrete crew might miss Friday payroll. By late afternoon, 3 investor helicopters dropped into a silent construction site, full of machines nobody was allowed to move. Later I learned what Calvin quietly told Vanessa. He had known the permit could not transfer quickly. He just believed I would never walk away. By sunset, Halt's statement was on every local page from Durango to Raven County. It did not mention the blasting waiver, the private wells below the ridge, or the clause that would have made my company responsible for explosives we did not control. It said a local contractor had abandoned the project during a critical construction window. By supper, the radio hosts had sanded it down to one clean lie. One stubborn contractor versus 600 jobs. Sophie found our home address in the comments, under an article accusing me of extorting a billionaire. She did not cry. She just turned the phone around and showed me, which was worse. Then my bank called. They had seen Halt terminate the contract and froze the credit line I used for fuel and payroll. That night, Vanessa offered one final compromise through Calvin. Remain permit holder for 14 days, accept the pay reduction, and Halt would soften the ugliest words in the blasting waiver. I told him no again. But the answer tasted different with my daughter sitting at the kitchen table tracing highway lines on an old county map, like she was already imagining where we would go. Before I could put the phone down, Rachel called. Loaded explosive charges were still drilled into the mountainside, and a storm was pushing in. I returned under county emergency authority, not Halt's contract, to help secure the blast area before snow buried the collars. Vanessa met me near the bench. "I'm glad you reconsidered," she said. "Explosives don't care who won an argument," I told her, and walked past. We worked under portable lights until our gloves soaked through. Then I saw the charge sheets clipped inside the blasting trailer. The numbers did not match the vibration limits attached to my permit. Several recent blasts had used more explosive per delay than the certified plan allowed. Rachel laid the blast sheets beside the county-approved plan on the hood of her truck, holding the pages down with a tape measure and a chipped coffee mug. Snow hissed against the portable lights while she ran one gloved finger from the permitted vibration limits to the actual charge weights. She did it twice, slower the second time, because nobody wanted the math to say what it said. "These aren't small adjustments," she finally told Vanessa. "You've got repeated deviations near the lower ridge." That was where Gideon Walsh's ranch sat in the shadow of the mountain, where his cattle crossed under the haul road, and his wells pulled from old water running through stone, long before Halt Summit had a name. Gideon arrived in a mud-splashed pickup before Rachel finished photographing the sheets. He slammed the door hard enough to make every safety cone tremble. "2 wells went cloudy this morning," he said, holding up a mason jar of gray water. "And there's a crack across my foundation, wide enough to catch a fingernail." Vanessa looked at the jar like it belonged to a world her reports had failed to describe. "My geotechnical team told me the blasting stayed inside allowable limits," she said. Her voice had control in it, but not certainty. Calvin stood near the trailer steps with his phone in his hand, and for once he was not typing. He admitted the operations team had been following a revised production schedule to remove rock faster before winter pinned the site down. I had seen that schedule months earlier. I refused to certify it without additional groundwater monitoring, and I had marked it outside my permit package in plain red notes. Calvin had treated that refusal like a negotiation problem, another contractor being cautious to protect his price, not a technical boundary. so Hart's internal schedule kept moving, while my official permit stayed cleaner than the mountain underneath it. Vanessa looked from Calvin to me, then to Gideon's jar of ruined well water. I watched her understand that the permit she had called leverage was the only thing on that site still forcing a human name to answer for what happened beyond the resort fence. The red placard was not magic. It was a promise someone could be punished for breaking. I ordered my name removed from every remaining Hart safety posting until the violations were independently reviewed. By evening, the county opened an investigation into the entire site. Because Cole Civil had still been contractor of record when some of those blasts happened, my own civil contractor license went under review too. The licensing investigator met me in a county conference room that smelled like wet coats and copier toner. He was polite, which somehow made it worse. He said being unaware of unsafe work under my permit might not be enough. A responsible contractor was expected to maintain control, not just paperwork. I sat there with both hands around bad coffee, understanding that walking away had not carried my name out of Hart Summit. If my license was suspended, I would not just lose that mountain. I would lose Cole Civil, 14 years, 1 borrowed excavator, and 19 families who had trusted my signature. Vanessa offered Hart's legal team before I left the building. She stood by the courthouse steps with snow melting on her coat and said they could defend me if I reactivated site access immediately. I told her no. A lawyer paid by Hart would protect Hart first, and I had already learned what responsibility without control looked like. Marisol Vega confronted me in the parking lot before I reached my truck. Hart owed her $312,000. Her workers could not pay rent with my clean conscience. Sophie heard every word when Marisol said, "You got to walk away. The rest of us are still trapped under your decision." That night I found the Hart Summit sticker peeled off my hard hat and stuck to the trash can. Sophie was at the kitchen table with homework open and nothing written. "I'm tired of every adult acting like one project matters more than our whole life," she said. Before I could answer, Rachel called. A rain-on-snow storm was coming. The unfinished road cut was exposed, and water could saturate the slope above Gideon's property. The county needed someone who knew every culvert and wall. I agreed to lead emergency stabilization, but only under county authority, and with every subcontractor paid directly. Rain came hard before daylight, warm enough to rot the old snow, and cold enough to burn your hands through wet gloves. My crew reopened drainage channels along the suspended access road, while Marisol's people set temporary barriers near the creek crossing. We were no longer Hart contractors, at least not that morning. We were names on a county emergency sheet, trying to keep a mountain from sending water and rock into ranch houses below. Troy worked beside me in silence, longer than usual. When we stopped near the upper trench to clear frozen gravel from a culvert mouth, he finally said he had seen blasting crews working beyond the sequence I approved weeks earlier. I looked at him and felt something give way before the slope ever moved. Troy was my superintendent and closest friend. He had been my eyes when I was off-site chasing invoices, bids, and payroll, which meant his silence was not paperwork, it was personal. He said Hart had made it clear any contractor causing delays could be replaced, and he knew how close we were to missing checks again. That excuse sounded too familiar to dismiss. Later, Sophie handed me a thermos near the pickup and said, "Dad, he's not the only one afraid to bring you problems." She looked toward the men digging in the rain. "They all know you're one late payment from losing everything." I wanted to defend myself. Instead, I watched water run off my hard hat and realized desperation had taught people to stay quiet inside my small company too. Vanessa had not invented that kind of fear. She had just built a taller office around it. We were still short of the upper drainage trench when the first section of cut slope collapsed. It came with a deep, cracking sound, then a shove of mud and broken rock that pushed an excavator sideways like a toy. The machine slammed against the bench, half-tipped, bucket buried, with a young operator trapped inside the cab. Runoff backed behind the slide and started spilling toward 2 ranch houses below. Men shouted over radios that cut in and out with the storm. Vanessa arrived in a company helicopter that had no business flying in that weather, took one look at the water, and told her security chief to stop guarding equipment and start evacuating families. For the first time all day, nobody argued about who had authority. We were tying off a rescue line when the mountain groaned again. Above the trapped excavator, a second section of slope broke loose. I stayed on stable ground with one boot braced against the grader blade and talked Troy toward the overturned excavator by radio. The slope above him was still shedding mud in sheets, but he crawled close enough to throw the recovery line around the machine's frame while the young operator beat one glove against the cracked cab glass. I could hear Sophie behind me, telling people to back up from the creek edge, using the same calm voice I used on job sites, and for 1 second, that scared me more than the mountain did. Vanessa opened the unfinished luxury lodge before anyone asked. An investor on speaker warned her that insurance would not cover public occupancy, but she cut him off and ordered the imported sofas, rugs, and display furniture stripped from the lower floor. Muddy laborers, ranch families, kids in pajamas, dogs, oxygen tanks, and wet blankets came through doors built for wealthy guests who had not arrived yet. We pulled the operator free seconds before the excavator slid into the flooded channel and vanished under brown water. Gideon still refused to step inside until his cattle and his elderly neighbor were accounted for. Vanessa sent her own drivers back into the storm. By daylight, nobody was calling her generous. Generosity did not fix permits. The access road remained unsafe, the project frozen, and the county investigation alive. Engineers picked through the collapse with probes and flags until Rachel stopped beside a broken wall of old stone under the slope. It was an irrigation gallery, buried for generations, carrying water through the mountain. She looked up from the drawings and asked who had moved the excavation boundary close enough to cut into it. Every engineer turned toward Hart's most recent construction set. Months earlier, I had approved a safer access road alignment that stayed away from the old irrigation system. It was longer, lower, and uglier on a spreadsheet because it required a temporary steel bridge instead of carving so much rock out of the ridge. Hart hated that bridge. They hated the delivery time, the crane cost, and the 3 extra weeks it added before heavy traffic could reach the upper benches. Later, somebody shifted the road about 60 feet upslope, close enough to save millions in bridge work and close enough to make the mountain lie. I had seen that revision once in a late packet Calvin called preliminary. Across the top, in red, I wrote, "Not included in current access certification," then sent it back with a request for subsurface testing. To me, that meant do not build here until we know what is underneath. To Calvin, he admitted, it meant paperwork had not caught up yet. He stood in the lodge's makeshift command room with mud on his cuffs and said he believed the restriction was another open item, not a hard stop at the boundary. Rachel asked him whether anyone from Cole Civil had later signed the shifted alignment. He looked at the drawings, then at me, and said no. Right there in writing. Nobody laughed. Nobody even breathed loud. Vanessa found her own approval on the cost-saving revision in an email chain printed from Calvin's files. She had not ordered anyone to ignore my note. She had not pointed at the mountain and said, "Cut there anyway." But she had approved the savings, demanded the schedule hold, and rewarded every person who made impossible dates look possible. The collapse was not simply bad weather, or one reckless blasting crew. Hart's whole pressure chain had turned a technical not approved into solve it later, and later had arrived as muddy water pushing toward ranch houses. Vanessa could have blamed Calvin and preserved herself for one more meeting. Instead, when Rachel asked for a formal statement, she said her approval helped create the pressure that pushed work beyond my certified area. I watched her lawyers look at each other like the floor had disappeared. That admission strengthened my licensing defense because it proved I had excluded the shifted road from my permit. It also weakened Hart's insurers, terrified investors, and made the lenders reconsider whether the project still had a controllable path forward. By evening, the next construction draw was frozen. Millions in unpaid invoices stopped in place, and the mountain was not the only thing sliding downhill. Once the financing draw froze, Hart could not release millions in pending construction payments without triggering a fight with lenders. That sounded like executive language until Marisol's crew walked off another job because she could not make payroll. 2 of my former employees called from Wyoming and Nevada, apologizing like men leaving a burning house had done something rude. They had kids, mortgages, fathers in dialysis chairs. I could not blame them, which made it hurt worse. Vanessa learned that Calvin had been holding subcontractor invoices on purpose, using pressure, the way some men use a clamp. Companies like mine would accept revised terms quicker if payroll was close enough to fail. She was furious until he opened the executive bonus structure she had built: schedule recovery, reduced change orders, cash preservation. Those words sat on the page looking cleaner than the lives they had squeezed. Calvin did not yell. He just said, "I did not invent the pressure. I learned what you paid me to protect." Vanessa used personal funds to guarantee immediate wages already earned by hourly crews, but she refused to call it charity or pretend those payments erased legitimate project debts. She made payroll public, line by line, so workers knew it was owed, not gifted. That same afternoon, a highway contractor in Nevada offered me steady salary, benefits, no business debt, and enough income to give Sophie the predictable life I had been promising since her mother died. I showed her the email at our kitchen table. She said she would go if I asked. What she did not say was whether she wanted to. Then the state investigator called. My final license review had been scheduled for the same week Nevada needed my answer. Hart's attorneys built the cleanest ugly argument I had ever seen. Cole Civil, they said, remained responsible contractor until I physically surrendered the permit placard at 11:58. That meant every unsafe blast and every shifted boundary before that minute could be framed as my failure of supervision. It would preserve Hart's insurance position, keep lenders calmer, and put most of the regulatory weight on the man who had already been called stubborn, greedy, and reckless on local radio. One lawyer even said it kindly, like kindness made it less of a knife. "The timeline is defensible," he told Vanessa. "It is not our job to make Mr. Cole's defense for him." I stood outside that conference room with my license number printed on a folder and heard enough through the thin glass to know exactly how small my life looked on their board. Vanessa could have let them use it. A month earlier, I would have expected nothing else. Instead, she placed a folder on Rachel Kim's desk, filled with internal emails, marked drawings, and meeting notes, showing every time I had excluded the revised road and faster blasting schedule from my certification. There were my red comments, my requests for groundwater monitoring, my refusal to sign the upslope alignment, and Calvin's replies treating those warnings like negotiation delays. Her decision nearly cleared my license in one stroke, and it opened Hart to liability big enough to make investors speak in whispers. When the licensing board restored my full contracting authority, I sat in my truck outside the county building holding the letter and felt less victory than exhaustion. My name was back, but my company was still broke. That night, I told Sophie about the Nevada offer. Steady salary, benefits, no business debt. A place where my phone might not ring at midnight because somebody needed fuel money or a slope was sliding. I admitted staying in Colorado could mean rebuilding from almost nothing. Maybe selling equipment, maybe calling men I had just sent home and asking them to trust me again with less than before. She folded the licensing letter carefully and set it beside the Nevada email. "I want stability," she said. "I just don't want it if the price is watching you get scared to say no again." I did not have an answer for that, only the sound of snowmelt dripping from our gutters. Before I decided anything, Rachel delivered worse news to Vanessa. The damaged access road could not be recertified before winter, at any reasonable cost. Hart Summit had a legal permit problem no signature from me could fix. By the next morning, investors were no longer talking about delay. They were talking about mothballing Hart Summit until spring, maybe longer. That meant a half-built mountainside sitting exposed through winter, unpaid local businesses waiting behind frozen financing, and hundreds of seasonal workers losing the jobs they had counted on. The place looked like a paused disaster, machines parked in mud, orange fence sagging under wet snow, concrete forms filling with ice. Vanessa asked me in front of Rachel, Marisol, and 2 silent lenders whether there was any technically safe way to reach the site before winter. I pulled out the design Hart had refused months earlier. It was not dramatic. It was not clever. It was just safer. A longer, lower-gradient haul road using an existing forestry corridor and a temporary steel bridge instead of blasting deeper into the ridge. Hart rejected it because it cost more, added almost 3 weeks, and made the resort's schedule look honest. The route was still viable, but it crossed temporary easements belonging to 14 local families, including Gideon Walsh. Vanessa heard viable and went straight back to the muscle memory that had built her company. "Then get me their signatures," she said. I closed the folder before she could touch the map. "They're not my employees," I told her. "They're not my leverage. If you need their land, you ask them." For the first time since I had met her, Vanessa had to look at a delay she could not order, threaten, or buy through a manager. 14 families could simply say no. Gideon was the first porch she visited. He opened the door, listened just long enough to know why she was there, and did not invite her inside. Vanessa did not send land agents after that. She went house by house, in boots that were wrong for ranch mud, and learned what people had been trying to tell Hart, through lawyers for months. Their demands were not wild. Groundwater monitoring at shared wells, limited truck hours so kids were not meeting gravel haulers before sunrise, protected cattle crossings, emergency road access that could not be blocked by resort security, dust control that meant something on dry afternoons, enforceable penalties if Hart violated the agreement, not soft promises hidden in meeting notes. Several families also said unpaid local subcontractors had to be made whole before any new resort spending resumed. They were tired of watching billion-dollar plans move while ordinary invoices sat cold. Vanessa agreed to most conditions, not with warmth but with a new habit of writing things down before answering. Gideon still refused. The safer route stayed farther from the broken slope, but it still cut close enough to the spring his family had used for generations that he would not sign. I walked the map with Rachel and saw the problem I had avoided saying out loud. My alternate design could shift again, farther from the spring and onto better ground, but only if Hart eliminated a planned row of ski and luxury residences tucked along that bench. Future sales value was roughly $30 million. Calvin heard the number and almost laughed from disbelief. Investors said the resort could not keep surrendering profitable pieces every time someone objected. Lawyers called it a dangerous precedent. One of them said families would start thinking refusal had a price tag. Gideon, who was standing close enough to hear, said, "Maybe risk always had one. You just never put it on your side of the page." Vanessa stood over the map longer than anyone expected. Months earlier, she would have asked who could be pressured, what clause could be used, which family needed a better offer. This time she took a black marker and crossed out the condo row herself. The room went quiet, except for the heater clicking against the wall. "Revise the plan," she said. Nobody clapped. Nobody called it noble. $30 million disappeared from a line item, and the mountain did not move an inch because of it. Gideon did not thank her when Rachel brought him the new alignment. He studied it on his porch with one hand on the rail and said, "Now you're finally paying for the risk, instead of sending the bill downhill." By dusk, 13 families had signed. One still refused. Without all 14, the alternate haul route could not be built continuously, and Hart Summit remained one missing yes from dying in place. The Delgado place sat at the end of a county road with snow packed hard in the tire ruts and a wheelchair ramp built from fresh lumber that had not weathered yet. Their son, Luis, had been injured months earlier driving for a Hart subcontractor on a haul shift that ran too long. The easement money was not what stopped them. His mother showed Vanessa a stack of medical notices and said he had lost coverage when the subcontractor folded while waiting on delayed Hart invoices. Vanessa offered to pay for his treatment personally. Mrs. Delgado did not even touch the check. "Another injured boy tomorrow should not need to know a billionaire by name," she said. That was when I spoke before I had fully worked it out. A project-wide worker protection fund, financed by developers and prime contractors, with medical coverage continuing during payment disputes and safety investigations. Vanessa's first answer was no, not because she hated the idea, but because agreeing meant admitting Hart owed responsibility beyond people wearing Hart badges. She stood in that small kitchen, looking at Luis's crutches near the refrigerator, and finally said the fund would cover every worker on Hart Summit, including subcontracted laborers. Mrs. Delgado signed the easement after that, not because she had been bought, but because the protection would still exist when her son's case was old news. 2 hours later, Rachel handed me the completed alternate road engineering package. Legally, I could reactivate access as contractor of record if I chose. Before I made it back to my truck, the investors called with an offer nearly 4 times my original fee. Sign directly with them, remove Vanessa from operational control, and restart the project under their authority. The investor offer sat on my phone like a loaded tool I had finally been handed by mistake. It would save Cole Civil instantly. Payroll, fuel, equipment notes, Sophie's house, all of it could be steadied with one signature. It would also humiliate Vanessa in front of the same industry that had watched her order me off the mountain. I could become the man who took control of the project she once thought I was too desperate to leave. A younger version of me might have called that justice and slept fine for one night. Sophie did not say what to do. She just watched my face, the way children do when they are trying to learn which kind of man a hard day makes. Vanessa did not ask me to protect her position. She came to the shop after dark, stood beside the framed county maps, and said if removing her made the project safer, she would accept it. That made revenge harder to hold. She was no longer the woman who placed my payroll weakness on a plywood table and expected me to fold. She was still responsible for what she had built, but she was no longer pretending control and courage were the same thing. I refused the investor's private control deal. Instead, I gave Rachel a list that did not care who sat in the CEO chair: independent county inspections, worker stop authority, transparent blasting records, guaranteed subcontractor payment timelines, and every family protection already negotiated. I also refused to become permanent gatekeeper. If Hart later replaced Cole Civil, the permit needed a safe transfer process with inspection checkpoints, public records, and legal responsibility, moving only with actual control. No future contractor should be able to hold the mountain hostage, and no future contractor should be forced to carry blame for decisions made over his head. Vanessa accepted a reduced operational role and gave up the authority to override safety decisions for schedule reasons. Hart paid proven-back invoices. I received fair compensation for work performed and losses caused by the improper termination. but no fantasy fortune big enough to make the past clean. I signed the new access certification only after Rachel, the subcontractors, and the affected families signed their own parts. When heavy equipment reached the gate for the first time in months, nobody cheered. The convoy waited under a gray sky, while diesel engines idled low. Before the first truck moved, a 23-year-old traffic worker raised one hand. Runoff was crossing the temporary bridge approach. Every old habit in that place leaned toward hurry. Vanessa looked at the clock, looked at the waiting trucks, then said, "Nobody moves until she's satisfied." Halt Summit opened a full season late, smaller than the renderings that had once hung in the investor trailer. The luxury condo row above Gideon's Spring never came back, and the resort lost money before it welcomed guests. Vanessa and her investors paid for that delay in numbers I will never earn. But the people who finished the work knew when their invoices would clear, and they knew a safety objection could not quietly erase their livelihood. Calvin left Halt after accepting responsibility for hiding the permit problem and withholding invoices. He was not the emotional ending, because one polished man with a bad spreadsheet had not created the whole machine. The bonus structure changed. The invoice rules changed. The workers who used to stand outside the room now had seats in it. Marisol's company survived and became one of the first firms represented on the Independent Contractor Council. Troy stayed with me, but our friendship changed in the only way trust can, after silence does damage. We wrote down what used to depend on loyalty. Sophie and I kept the house, though that was not the biggest thing we kept. I restructured Cole Civil, so one missed corporate invoice could never threaten 19 families at once. We took fewer jobs. I turned down Nevada. I kept the company local. With protected weekends, Sophie wrote onto the same calendar as my inspections. Some Saturdays we still drove mountain roads, but not because a crisis was calling. She brought maps anyway, because that was who she was. The original red access permit hangs framed in our shop, not as a trophy over Vanessa, but beside the unsigned contract she gave me that morning. I keep them where my crew can see both, the paper that gave me authority and the paper that tried to separate authority from responsibility. Months later, Vanessa came to the shop with a new maintenance road proposal. No helicopter, no lawyers waiting in the truck. She handed me a contract and a pen, then said, "Take whatever time you need." I almost smiled, because the sentence was small, but the distance between that and noon in the pavilion was the whole story. I read every page before touching the pen. Sophie read it too, sitting on the workbench with a pencil tucked behind her ear. Marisol checked the payment terms. Rachel had already reviewed the inspection language. Nobody rushed. Nobody stared at me, like hunger should sign faster than judgment. At 11:58 on the day Vanessa tried to force me to choose between survival and responsibility, I thought the power was leaving with the only permit that could move her project. I was wrong, or only half right. The paper mattered, because it made people stop, but it was never the most important thing I carried out. The real power was quieter than that. It was Sophie seeing me scared, and still watching me refuse. It was my crew, learning that bad news brought early would not be punished for being expensive. It was Vanessa, learning that a deadline did not become moral just because many people depended on it. I eventually signed because the agreement no longer asked any man to lend his name to work he could not control. Then I capped the pen myself and handed it back. The real power was knowing I could lose the deal and still refuse to put my name on something I knew was wrong.